welcome everybody to our first panel of the afternoon, which is called Race, Representation, and Monstrosity. Unfortunately, the person who was supposed to be moderating didn't end up being able to come, so I'm your substitute moderator for the day. We have four amazing panelists who will each talk for 15 minutes. I'm going to introduce all of them at once and then let them go in order. Our first panelist is Katya Vrtis, and her paper today is called The Triple-Coded Monster, Teaching Bigotry in Classic Horror. Dr. Katya Vrtis is an independent scholar studying freakery and monstrosity as modes of dehumanization. Her recent work appears in Monsters in Performance, Freak Inheritance, Journal of African American Studies, and Theater History Studies. Katya is the co-founder and chair of Disability Theater and Performance and MATC's Accessibility Officer. Our second panelist today, Shadow Zimmerman, is going to be giving a talk called More Than Monsters, Her and Note and the Whole Humanity of Black Horror. Dr. Shadow Zimmerman is visiting assistant professor of theater history, literature, and criticism at Northern Arizona University. His research explores the limits of liberalism and the racial relationships of the historical avant-garde. His scholarship has been featured in Theater Symposium, the Black Theater Review, and How to Teach a Play. Our third panelist, Michael Kobre, is giving a paper called This Man, This Monster, Golems, Tough Jews, and the Torment of Benjamin J. Grimm. Michael Kobre is Dana Professor of English at Queen's University of Charlotte. His essays and stories have appeared in Michigan Quarterly Review, South Atlantic Review, Tin House, Tri-Quarterly, West Branch, Make, and other journals. He's the author of Walker Percy's Voices. His writing has also been featured in the anthologies Reading the Boss, Interdisciplinary Approaches to the Works of Bruce Springsteen, Walker Percy's The Moviegoer at 50, and Superhero Bodies, Identity, Materiality, Transformation. And our fourth panelist, Michael Chemers, will be giving a talk called Monster in the Closet, the Golem and the Dramaturgy of Empathy. And Michael doesn't need any introduction, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. He's a professor of dramatic literature in the Department of Performance, Play, and Design here at UC Santa Cruz. His work on monsters includes The Monster in Theater History, This Thing of Darkness,
Great book.
and Monsters in Performance, Essays on the Aesthetics of Disqualification. Dr. Chemers is, of course, our wonderful founding director of the Center for Monster Studies. So I will now turn things over to Katya.
Thank you, everybody. In his 1993 book, The Monster Show, A Cultural History of Horror, David J. Skald attempts to divide early film creatures into general types, positing the four categories of Dracula, the human vampire, the Walking Dead creation of Frankenstein, the werewolf duality of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and the freak from A Nightmare Sideshow. However, despite this supposedly clear delineation by kind, Skald recognizes the figure's slippery, eternal process of reconstructing, noting that if one looks long enough, one monster eventually blurs into another. This physical and categorical plasticity merely reflects the monster's greatest power, its semiotic versatility. Free-floating signifiers of the intolerable other, the monster rises to every occasion, reclothed in contemporary social crises, to police the border at the edge of the human, and to ensure those most recently cast out remain marked and unable to reverse their banishment. The monster, as per Jeffrey Jerome Cohen's fourth thesis, dwells at the gate of difference, and as cultural norms change, one kind of difference becomes another as the normative categories of gender, sexuality, national identity, and ethnicity slide together like the imbricated circles of a Venn diagram, objecting from the center that which becomes the monster. This phenomenon is not new. It seems innate to the cross-cultural phenomenon of monstrosity. However, pre-modern communication technologies of orality, manuscript, and even block printing are expensive in time and labor and can take generations to successfully spread new ideological innovations across even a single territory or language group. Movable type sped up the process, but it took cheap mass marketing of publication to allow the explosion of monsters and monsterization across the 19th century. The innovation of film, followed swiftly by the creation of the movie industry and popular culture behemoth of Hollywood, industrialized this process, making horror films and their starring monsters into core sites for negotiation of cultural anxieties around difference, power, and the dehumanization of marginalized populations. While future generations would, of course, add their own obsessions, from the McCarthy-style political paranoia of Invasion of the Body Snatchers to the anti-commercialism of Dawn of the Dead, the pre-Hays Code period of American horror remains tightly focused on the tripartite concerns inherited from its freak show predecessor, patriarchal heterosis sexism, eugenic ableism, and colonial racism, plus the addition of virulent anti-Semitism. While individual films and their monsters are weighted more strongly to one theme and its associated identity oppositions or another, the synchronous encoding of monsters as queer, raced, and crypt is a definitive characteristic of early US horror cinema. For example, the creature of the 1910 Frankenstein, as played by Charles Ogle, is clearly, if erratically, debilitated. His lip droops as if due to a palsy or stroke, and his gait, while not matching the identifiable pattern of any specific disability, is altered, suggesting significant malformation of the lower limbs to match his stiff, thickened, and overly long fingers created through prosthetic gloves. Ogle's makeup work extended his nose into a grotesque pointed hook, a clear visual reference to the Jewish nose of anti-Semitic imagination, a visual trait dating at least to the 12th century in Western art history. The creature's ragged, improvised clothing and wild hair are more loosely suggestive of the related visual markers of Jewishness in medieval art: the drawn, listless faces, disheveled beards, pilia cornata, horned caps, long robes, prayer shawls, and noticeably irregular noses. And that's a quote. As a result, audiences could read at a glance the ethnic and crypt coding of Ogle's monster. Meanwhile, the queer coding is somewhat more complex. The information is provided in two ways, both common to such figures across the period. The first is in his appearance following the intertitle, Frankenstein appalled at the sight of his evil creation, wherein the creature stands larger than life over his creator lying prone on the bed. The monster reaches out to touch Frankenstein, even trying to cup his face before issuing a snarl rather than a kiss. The intimacy of the moment, the closeness and physical contact, and of course, the bed and the character's position relative to it all serve to create a sexualized reading in which the feminized doctor is threatened, and perhaps aroused, by the unwanted sadomasochistic erotic interest of the creature. This kind of semi-desired sexualized threat is a recurring trope, particularly associated with the vampire's nocturnal visit to the maiden's boudoir, and its deployment at this moment provides a clear reference to the fear of emergent openly queer spaces and culture following the end of World War I and the nation's switch to majority urbanization. I'm sorry, that was unclear. As continuation in later films. The second intimation of queer desire appears at the end of the film, after the wedding guests leave and the creature breaks in for a climactic battle. In a sharp departure from Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley's book, the monster is revealed to be an aspect of Frankenstein himself, doubled into a Jekyll and Hyde heterosexual good side and the suppressed evil queer one that must be vanquished to ensure the success of the required patriarchal marriage and the eventual birth of eugenically pure babies to maintain white colonial dominance. Frankenstein must overcome his Jungian shadow self and commit wholly to his new wife, abandoning any illicit desires, and having done so, the monster is conquered, its evil mind overcome by love and disappears abruptly, leaving the human bridegroom contemplating his own reflection in the mirror before going forth to be fruitful and multiply. This sort of bowdlerization of source texts to apply the tripled alignment to their monsters occurs across the early film industry. Mr. Hyde wears blackface or similar skin darkening in 1912, 1913, and 1931, among others, in addition to cripping up. And Dr. Jekyll gains a respectable female love interest to be threatened by and contrasted to Hyde's deviant sexual appetites. Dr. Moreau's beast people, already coded Black or Pacific Islander, become even more physically debilitated by Moreau's torturous experiments than in H.G. Wells' novel. And Edward Prendick, Parker, in 1932's Island of Lost Souls and Voodoo Island, is given a fiancée determined to bring him home. In the Island of Lost Souls, Prendick/Parker is also given another potential lover, the entrancingly transgressive Loda the Panther Lady, raising the strikingly common specter of bestiality in pre-code Hollywood monster films, a phenomenon philosopher Georges Bataille identifies as core to objection, arguing in his 1934 essay, Objection in Miserable Forms, that it is fitting that the insolent rich evoke the bestiality of the miserables. They have already taken from these disinherited, the possibility of being human. This is additionally and infamously suggested in movies diverse as King Kong, Son of Ingagi, and even the 1925 Phantom of the Opera, in which Lon Chaney's makeup suggests at once a skull, an ape or monkey, and the horrifying facial injuries common to World War I veterans, and with it, the violence and degradation of trench warfare. Meanwhile, Chaney's performance also became a spectacle of artistic suffering and performer hypercapacity through the media focus on his technically masterful and profoundly painful mechanical nose removal device. Triple coding attached allegations of perversity to Crips, genetic inferiority to queers, and congenital malformation to the racial other, along with the infertility of the so-called racial hybrids created through the obsessively feared and policed practice of miscegenation. Triple coding works through chains of insinuation and evocation to create the overdetermined other, which taints anyone subjected to monsterization. The recurrence and linking of these particular three axes of identification and oppression in the classic film monster, which remains stuck to the contemporary monster even as other meanings have also accreted, does not merely suggest the significance of these modes of difference as sites of cultural anxiety. Rather, the founding mythology of the United States and its system of power depend on the simultaneous deployment of these three Saussurean binaries. The American system of white patriarchal control rests on the claim of white feminine purity, moral, sexual, medical, and genetic, and the purity of her future children, under constant threat from physically powerful menacing men of color, as is extensively documented by Grace Elizabeth Hale in Making Whiteness, The Culture of Segregation, 1890 to 1940. Non-white women are, of course, erased from this construct, as to admit their presence is to add complexity, nuance, and possibly even reality to the brutal efficacy of the propagandist message. In this narrative, the imperiled white woman must remain under the absolute control of the white patriarch, as too must the threatening racial other, justifying, supposedly, the system, as without both victim and villain, the self-declared hero is revealed instead to be the oppressor. Race and gender are the most visible within this system, but all members of the mythic triad must possess a fit, abled body for the parts to cohere into a complete ideology. The core sociopolitical power dynamics of the United States depends on the monsterization, the ongoing and concurrent monsterization of all who could threaten that founding myth, should only their humanity be recognized. This includes Black, Indigenous, and person of color populations, plus all colonial subjects, ethnic or ethno-religious minorities, gay, lesbian, bi, and pansexual and asexual persons, transgender, agender, third gender, and otherwise gender expansive or gender nonconforming groups, queers, and otherwise non-reproducing families, and the disabled, the debilitated, those with excessive or insufficient bodily form, the mad, the mentally ill, the crips, and the neurodiverse, and all the unruly threats to white male power. To do otherwise is to threaten the entire paradigm. However, while ideology may demand monsterization, monsters offer a uniquely unstable foundation for a society. The threat of the monster or freak, freaks being liminal figures recognized as both human and monster in the same skin, the ultimate expression of what Elizabeth Gross names their intolerable ambiguity, is the same characteristic which makes them into figures of fascination, desire, and fantasy. Per Gross, the freak is an object of simultaneous horror and fascination because, in addition to whatever infirmities or abilities he or she exhibits, the freak is an ambiguous being whose existence imperils categories and oppositions dominant in social life. Freaks are those human beings who exist outside of and in defiance of the structure of binary oppositions that govern our basic concepts and modes of self-definition. Furthermore, the ontological dyads which structure the American system are neither fixed, gender, sexuality, race, and disability, all being complex multivariable systems rather than simple oppositions, nor are there current hierarchical positions. Both the core self-identifiers and the social dominance of those in one or more of the empowered orientations are always under threat, and so require constant attestation to maintain. The expression of this dynamic in the freak show and later in horror cinema is explained by Rosemary Garland Thompson. The immense popularity of the shows between the Jacksonian and progressive eras suggests that onlookers need to constantly reaffirm the difference between them and us at a time when immigration, emancipation of the slaves, and female suffrage confounded previously reliable indices of status and privilege. The more heterogeneous the bodily traits of the enfranchised became, the less clearly marked power was in the egalitarian social order. These performances were particularly attractive to, quote, those whose social rank was most tenuous, whose inclusion in the dominant normate population was most under threat, and who required the most assurance of their status within it. While horror films and their resident monsters do ideologically useful work in stabilizing the fragile system of socio-political dominance, the attractive force of the monster mean audiences may at any point switch their allegiance away from the official heroes. Monsters are unbound, truly free from any law or government or expectation of normative behavior, and as a result are strongly eroticized, their transgressive nature appealing to humanity's imp of the perverse, to use Edgar Allan Poe's terminology. In particular, there is always the possibility for audiences to relate to and support the monster, rehumanizing those coded to the figure. The collective nature of the pre-video movie-going experience provided a pressure for individual members of the audience to conform to the dominant view of the films and their politics. This remains true even in the works of James Whale, Paul Linney, and Todd Browning, among so many others who share at least some identifications with the monsters they created. As with the American Freak Show before it, and in sharp contrast to the horror novel, the Hollywood creature feature creates a ritual in which the large group of normative individuals and any non-normates hiding in the crowd intentionally seek out the abject in the freak or monster, sharing the thrill of engaging directly with the ultimate other, only to then collectively repudiate that which they have chosen to court, reassuring themselves and each other of both the justified nature of their dominant social positions and that they would never actually be tempted into leaving respectability, with all its power and limitations, to give in to the temptation, embrace the transgressive, and run off with the circus. As a result, the communal experience of audience participation fuses with the textual, visual, and cinematic pressure to resist empathizing with the monster, defying, though never totally preventing, a sympathetic reading of the objected figure and of the socially rejected other represented. Of course, in a different context, watching in a group of outsiders, for example, queer movie night during Pride, or even at home alone thanks to more recent technologies, a different reading becomes much more likely. Ultimately, the triple coding of the monster in early American film elides the difference between forms of deviance, teaching the audience to view all target populations as an inchoate, utterly inhuman monster to be feared and rejected absolutely. Additionally, those who may sympathize with one monsterized population would still be likely to fall prey to other biases and be conditioned into collective abjuration of the target groups, even including their own. It spread cultural bigotry by linking together unrelated groups and attaches the associated stereotypes to each monsterized population, to all of them, marking all three as innately dangerous and destabilizing threats, and attaching conceptions of race or ethnicity, gender and sexuality, and disability that have stuck so strongly that any American monster automatically carries these connotations. This overdetermination of bias decreases empathy for all monsterized populations and serves as a kind of propagandistic pedagogy of popular culture, helping to ensure that the power of the heterosexual, able-bodied white man continues unabated. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right. Would you like me to? Okay. Oh, I'm mic'd. Great. Thank you all again for this opportunity. More Than Monsters, Black Horror and the Whole Humanity of Her and Nope. Though scary stories, both spoken and printed, have an ancient genealogy, horror literature, as widely known, exploded in popularity throughout the 19th century. Continuing the lineage of Gothic horror begun by the Castle of Otranto in 1764, stories and novels such as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, John Polidori's The Vampire, and the multiple vampire incarnations since, and Robert Louis Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, famously set the standard for and became the early canon of horror literature. Perhaps not coincidentally, these touchstones of the genre feature monsters who have become household names. Fundamental horror films from early in the genre's development are also driven by monsters at the center, from Nosferatu to Creature from the Black Lagoon. Although many of Edgar Allan Poe's stories and other seminal entries, such as The Invisible Man and The Blair Witch Project, focus instead on the fear and dread of the unknown or unseen, these monsters have become ubiquitous icons of the horror genre. However, creators have begun to usurp these expectations. Especially, Black artists and filmmakers have begun to engage horror to explore the depths of humanity, specifically the human experiences of Black Americans and other marginalized people globally. Famously, Jordan Peele has released multiple Black horror films which capture, interrogate, and parody Black American experiences, from the fear of walking alone in a white suburban neighborhood as a Black man to the terror of kidnapping and human trafficking in Get Out and Us, respectively. Peele's newest film, Nope, from 2022, continues to refute the expectations of the genre as it uniquely uses horror as a means of expression and a gateway for exploring Black humanity. The inspired love child of a Western and an alien horror film, Nope barely features its monster, giving the creative take on a UFO fewer than 2 seconds of screen time in the first 45 minutes of the film. Instead, Peele uses Nope's runtime to explore the dimensions of its main characters, Otis and Emerald Haywood, and especially their bond as siblings. After OJ and M discover the extraterrestrial which haunts them, they do not cower in fear, they do not run, they do not fall prey or victim. They capitalize. Spurred by M's entrepreneurial spirit and the ultimate desire for an Oprah shot, a photograph worthy of an appearance on Oprah, the pair works to capitalistically prey on the hidden beast above. Though Nope and Peele are not unique in this treatment, other examples such as Candyman and Ma also notably explore the wholeness of Black characters and humanity. Her, 1925, a self-described mystery play in one act, though unpublished and therefore less known, also ought to be included in this lineage. The play, submitted anonymously to the 1925 Opportunity Literary Prize Contest, similarly includes only a small snippet of its titular ghost, choosing instead to delve into its main character's psyche, as well as her business as a seamstress and her relationship to her invalid husband. As such, the play demonstrates the values expressed in contemporaneous commentary by artists such as Willis Richardson and embraced by other authors, readers, and audience members connected to the journal Opportunity, and as well as the greater Harlem Renaissance. The valuation of and desire for more real characters with complex traits and dramatic conflicts, obstacles, and/or quandaries. These values also resonate with postmodern contemporary scholarship on Black dramaturgy by scholars such as Martine Key Green Rogers, who argues that, quote, you cannot divorce critical race theory from other types of critical theories, end quote, or critical analysis more broadly. In such a dramaturgical framework, it is essential to consider race in the same moment one considers other intersectional lines of identity, such as gender and class. No piece of her identity can be divorced, Green Rogers states, quote, but in some but in some rooms, some of those pieces of identity matter more than others, end quote. Green Rogers, like Peele and numerous other Black artists, also believe that theater and performance also ought to capture authentic Black life on stage, and in so doing, plant a seed for the greater, wider respect of and incorporation of Black culture into American identity. Her and Nope, nearly 100 years later, each effectively employ Black horror as a means of expression by emphasizing the more marginalized features of the genre. By choosing to feature their Black characters more than their monsters, the play and the film successfully share the wholeness of these experiences and Black American humans and humanity more broadly. This essay then shall demonstrate the success of these representations with analyses of both Her and Nope, emphasizing the wholeness of their characters and the valuation of Black humanity they achieve through their unique applications of the horror genre, its conventions, and its audience's expectations. In the next section, I do go over a bit of a summary of the horror genre, specifically the early 19th to 20th century conventions of looking at horror versus terror. Specifically, terror was a more minimalist, arguably more effective form of storytelling, whereas horror, quote, leaves little room for imagination and the process of contemplation is gutted by excess, end quote, according to Anne Radcliffe from 1826. In this sense, horror becomes derogatory, whereas terror and its minimalism may be used by writers to engage the reader's imagination and to create a mental picture of fear beyond what words could create. Horror tells a vivid story to scare its audience much more simply and, per Radcliffe, less effectively. However, this duality has been challenged by writers as early as Poe, whose lurid descriptions activated readers' deepest imagined fears in a way which combined both concepts of horror and terror. Especially, Black artists, writers, and filmmakers have embraced this intricate brand of horror to emphasize details which serve as shibboleths for and exemplify specific Black American experiences. The opening scene of Get Out, for instance, with Lakeith Stanfield as Andre walking alone in a picturesque, visibly predominantly white neighborhood, likely carries polarizing resonances along racial intersections. Whereas white audiences may find the scene familiar and reassuring, Black audience members are more likely to catch the code-switching terror hidden in the scene before Andre is inevitably abducted and abused. Resisting definitions of and expectations for horror even further, many Black creators transmogrify the monsters central to the genre into what Catherine Tartaglia labels the, quote, various monstrous characteristics of the Black experience, particularly in the United States, end quote. In her introduction, Tartaglia argues that horror as a, quote, genre well-suited to reflecting on reality, end quote, is the perfect medium for, quote, providing material for discussion surrounding the treatment of Black peoples and Blackness, end quote, such as the, quote, othering of Black peoples and cultures, end quote. Horror is an ideal medium for publicly interrogating people's lived experiences, and Black horror artists such as Jordan Peele and the anonymous author of Her have distinctly tapped the genre's potential to inform our understanding of Black characters and Black horror, or horror more broadly. And in so doing, these artists engage a mode of representation generations old, practiced by Black Americans for hundreds of years. Horror stories, especially those concerning hauntings, colloquially known as haints or hants, can be found throughout the historical oral traditions and literary records. Many enslaved Black Americans embraced haints and horror stories as a means of communally coping with the trauma of one's lived experience and, powerfully, as a means of memory and identity reclamation or recreation. Stories of ghosts and other haunting creatures of the night dot the recorded oral traditions of enslaved Black Americans, and many similar stories have been certainly lost to time and violence. As Kathleen Brogan explains in her Cultural Haunting, ghosts and hauntings are regularly represented, quote, wherever people must reconceive a fragmented, partially obliterated history, looking to a newly imagined past to redefine themselves for the future. In a sense, these haints in these stories can be read as the ghosts of their enslaved speakers' trauma, splintered history, and alienated family members' rights and dreams, as much as they also represent the literal spirits many of these storytellers believe surrounded them daily. This use of horror continues into early Black American print culture as well. Several stories within Charles Chesnutt's The Conjure Woman from 1899, notably Mars James's Nightmare, contain elements of malignant magic and tension which could be identified as horror, and the plot of Pauline Hopkins' serialized novel Of the Blood from 1902 and 1903 is spurred by an early visit to a haunted house in which Raoul Briggs, the primary protagonist, discovers the ghost of Dianthony Lusk of the Fisk University Singers. Literary references such as this, supported by the bountiful oral traditions of horror and hate stories in Black American popular culture, laid the foundation and framework for continued employment of horror tropes and monsters, especially ghosts and the alien or unknown, by other Black artists in the early 20th century and today. By the time its anonymous author submitted it to the Second Opportunity Literary Prize contest in 1925, then, Her would have been read and received as another ghost story at home in a recognized culture of modern Black horror. The 18-page mystery play in one act is set in the domestic yet commercial living room of its protagonist, Martha Alexander, at 8 o'clock one rainy evening in an undisclosed location, giving the play a possibly next-door power, only to be discovered a little bit later. The first page of this one act is dominated by one-act opening stage directions which describe reliable and religious Martha, her ill husband Pete, and the appropriately affordable Christian iconography which surrounds them. We as reader immediately discover that Martha, always immaculately dressed in her gray dress and white apron, makes a living washing clothes for some very old families in her home while she cares for her physically disabled husband who is unable to work. Additionally, Martha supplements her income by showing the rooms in the house and collecting rent for its owner, John Kinney. The opening scene portrays Martha's work as both washer and caretaker as the couple argues over an article Pete recently read about disabled workers learning to make money, a pursuit Martha thinks a waste of time. Pete explains that he merely hoped to take some of the burden off of his hardworking wife and thanks her. There ain't no woman like you, Martha, nowhere. And I know it, and God thanks, and I thank God for you every day and night. Martha then admits she's been tense and confrontational because there are guests scheduled to visit the apartment above theirs this evening. Even textually, the tone shifts powerfully. When Martha lowers her voice, which is pregnant with meaning, the text says, and she says, I saw Mr. Kinney earlier this morning. He's got some folks for up above. Pete responds, for upstairs, and Martha says, they're coming tonight to see the rooms. After our entrepreneurial exposition, we learn that Martha's part-time job isn't so straightforward. The conversation continues with Pete reckoning the prospective renters won't even show before the rain, because of the rain before the hook catches. Martha says, listen, it's her. Her, Pete says. Martha says, she's kept me awake these last 2 nights. Pete says, it ain't natural, this talk about her. Martha responds, of course it ain't natural, but it's real. What you hear is real, isn't it? Martha hears the unearthly sounds from upstairs which have haunted her for days, and the titular ghost is finally revealed, though not shown. Martha reveals that the unit hasn't been rented in over a year, and for the past 18 years, it's been difficult to get anyone to stay for long. Mr. Kinney himself even refuses to enter or show the unit out of fear, prompting Martha's part-time employment. Suddenly, the doorbell is heard. Martha opens the door, assuming the renters have arrived, only to discover John Kinney, standing upon the threshold, silent, gaunt, and austere, the text says, his eyes, quote, burning with a strange fire, end quote. To Martha's shock, Mr. Kinney announces that he has arrived to show the unit himself, explaining that it's time he did go up. The place may need a few repairs, he explains. Before the couple arrives to view the apartment, Mr. Kinney attempts to convince the Alexanders and arguably himself that the sounds Martha hears and the purported hauntings which have forced out tenants are simply misunderstood phenomena, or perhaps even Martha's ploy to scare off renters. Alice Smith and her husband Sam arrive, and the three cover the tension with small talk before Mr. Kinney takes the couple upstairs. Now alone, Martha worries to Pete that the couple will have no happiness up there and vows to tell the woman the truth about the upstairs room. Mr. Kinney and the couple return after a successful showing. Alice even remarks the place is just lovely, nice and clean too, end quote. Sam pulls bills from his wallet to pay for the rental, and Mr. Kinney realizes his wallet is missing. After Alice suggests he may have dropped it upstairs, he and Mr. Kinney head upstairs alone to search for it, refusing an offer for help from the others. Seizing her opportunity, Martha appeals to the couple. She says, listen, he'll be back any minute, and I've got something powerful important to say. You mustn't take the rooms lest you want to have more trouble than you know about. Those rooms, they're haunted. End quote. Martha's attempt at the truth are met with shock and then disbelief as Alice and Sam accuse her of attempting to scare them off in favor of other tenants. Martha then details the horrifying backstory of her, the ghost of the woman upstairs. Kinney, once a soldier, had met a beautiful Filipino woman and entranced her with suggestions of a possible life in America. Ultimately convincing her, he then purchased the home for her, only to force the poor woman to live in 2 small rooms upstairs while Kinney rented the others out, and she, quote, pined for the country and the grass and the flowers, end quote. After a final conflict in which Kinney refused to let the woman rent some additional rooms, the woman hanged herself in the unit upstairs to end her torment. Finally convinced, the couple turns to leave before a crash is heard upstairs, causing everyone to jump with fright. The group attempts to make sense of the noise before Martha commits to going upstairs to check on Mr. Kinney. Martha leaves and returns a short moment later to exclaim the play's final lines. Pete, you wanted a sign? I just saw John Kinney walking down the stairs with her. She had him by the hand, and she was laughing. The final stage directions are, the curtains start to descend just as Alice's piercing scream rings throughout the room. The end. As Alice's scream fills the darkness, we are left uneasy, identifying with the play's character and our mutual inability to make sense of what we have witnessed. Her is a powerful, unrecognized example of Black American horror nearly 100 years old. The play is titled, intriguingly, after its ghost, its iconic monster. However, its drama does not largely concern her. And although there is a resonating strength and appeal in its horrifying final moments, her is not successful because of this ghost. Rather, its strength can be found in its character and their relationships, especially Martha's resilience and resilient kindness. The play spends most of its time developing Martha and Pete, then John Kinney and Alice and Sam Smith, even the unnamed Filipino woman who haunts them, as fully fledged, wholly human characters. Her haunting is merely a cherry on the top. As explored earlier, this anonymous author's work and engagement of horror resonates with generations of artistic self-expression. Importantly, it also resonates with contemporary theory from the Harlem Renaissance, of which the editors, featured authors, and many readers of the journal Opportunity considered themselves members. Specifically, her strong character embodied the values expressed in publications such as Willis Richardson's treatise Characters, in which he says that there are thousands of cultured and refined Black Americans, Richardson agrees, but it's very necessary, quote, for characters to be interesting and distinctly a Black type in successful drama from the era. In order for him to be interesting, Richardson continues, quote, he must either do something or have something done to him, and in order for him to be a distinct Black type, he must be distinctly different from the white man, end quote. So too many Black characters in American plays were designed to be propagandistic or palatable, Richardson perceived, and were ultimately rendered raceless in their cultural sameness. Rather, Richardson believed Black characters ought to be interesting and dramatically engaged. They should experience conflict, overcome obstacles, make mistakes, not simply preach the values of Black humanity. Such characters could then captivate a greater number of audience members more successfully, indirectly achieving their desired result of Black American self-actualization and popular respect. Her caught me with its final haunting moment, but it continues to connect with me through its characters. With each read, I find myself focusing on still newfound details about each character's personality or past. Though the play was not rewarded or published in the 1925 contest, it does contain recognizable values contained in other plays from the area which were awarded, and as well as the editorials from the journal itself. I do have a large section here following on the similarities that we see in the film Nope, but just to skip ahead in the sake of time, scholar of Black horror Tenerife Due opens the 2019 retrospective documentary Horror Noir by speaking for her fellow interviewees and many Black Americans in her attestation that, quote, we've always loved horror. It's just that horror, unfortunately, hasn't always loved us. Black history is Black horror, end quote. Black Americans and Black folks worldwide have a cultural memory filled with traumas and violence which have served as meaningful subjects for exploration and interrogation through the lens of horror. However, Jordan Peele has become renowned for his ability to usurp tropes of the genre as he introduces audience to appealing characters and concepts which have audiences raving and new individuals developing an appreciation for Black characters, history, and culture. Get Out cleverly challenges marginalizing violence and the inequitably racialized threat of adoption I can't speak that line, I'm so sorry. Yet Nope challenges expectations even more intriguingly by exploring how little horror one needs to experience terror and a meaningful connection to Black character. Though it is not new or alone in this application, underrepresented examples of Black horror such as Her also exemplify this welcome appreciation for Black characters and their experiences. Although Black horror history has made for significant Black horror, it is refreshing and reaffirming to see examples which no longer need to engage these long-running discourses to succeed. The personal and institutional impact of slavery, racism, and widespread violence against Black people and culture are horrifying, but so are alien abductions and ghosts. And seeing realistic characters respond resiliently to these obstacles makes for great performances and intriguing horror, just as much as it demonstrates a burgeoning respect for and appreciation of Black folks and their experiences. Thank you so much.
Now the scary part, can we turn this on? All right, it's clobbering time. When Paul Wegener's The Golem opened in America at the Criterion Theater in New York City, wait, can I turn this on? I can't. All right. When Paul Wegener's The Golem opened in America at the Criterion Theater in New York City in June 1921, the German film ignited what one writer in the Yiddish newspaper Der Tag, The Day, would later call a kind of golem cult. A retelling of an old Jewish legend, The Golem featured Wegener, who both directed and starred in the film, as the clay giant brought to life to defend a fantastical Jewish ghetto in 16th century Prague. Over the course of its record-breaking 16-week run in the opulent 900-seat theater, The Golem at once electrified and divided its Jewish audiences, who flocked to the theater from the tenements in the Lower East Side where so many lived. Even if one critic in the Jewish Daily News, another Yiddish paper, called the film Goyish through and through, a fantasy of Judaism, there were still at least 2 new stage productions of the Golem legend in Yiddish theaters in 1921, including a musical version that featured its star in makeup and a costume fashioned after Wegener's, with the same crude helmet of sculpted hair, styled in something like a pageboy cut, the same tunic gathered at the waist by a heavy belt, and the same Star of David planted in the center of his chest like a superhero's insignia. So perhaps then, among all those newly formed American Jews buying tickets for a showing at the Criterion, the members of the audience might have included Ben and Rose Kurtzberg, who had emigrated from Austria at the turn of the century. And if Ben and Rose had attended a matinee, when tickets were half price, only 50 cents each, could they also have brought along their 4-year-old son, Jacob? It wasn't just a movie, after all. There was a live concert of Jewish music before the film, and a dance performance, a cartoon, and a Buster Keaton comedy afterwards. And if Jacob had seen the film, or maybe only heard his parents talk about it, or even about one of the stage productions inspired by the film in that Golem cult of 1921, what did he think? How might its images have haunted him? Because, of course, 4 decades later, Jacob Kurtzberg, now Jack Kirby, would create a kind of golem of his own in the monstrous form of Ben Grimm, named in part after Kirby's father, who'd been transformed by cosmic rays in Fantastic Four #1 in 1961 into an orange rock-like creature with enormous strength. The Thing, as he called himself now. And the image over on the left side of the screen is fan art. I want to credit that. I want to argue here that Ben Grimm, the Thing, is a kind of golem, and more than that as well. Like the golem in Wegener's film and many other versions of the story, the Thing is a figure of monstrosity, power, uncontrollable rage, and although this wouldn't be officially acknowledged for another 41 years, of Jewish identity too. Moreover, in that amalgamation of fearsome monstrosity and Jewish identity, the Thing, like the golem also, embodies a profoundly Jewish yearning for strength and a fear of it too, an ambivalence that's entangled with a culture-inscribed self-loathing of his own body. Of course, when Jack Kirby and Stan Lee created the Thing in 1961, in the always mysterious workings of their collaboration, often with little more than a scrap of a plot before Kirby would draw finished pages, and Lee would then add dialogue and captions, there was nothing overt to suggest Ben Grimm's Jewish identity. His background, as it was first detailed in A Visit with the Fantastic Four, #11, was a college football star from the wrong side of the tracks who later became a Marine fighter ace in World War II and was the hero of every American who could read a paper. It was only later, over many decades, in the work of many subsequent creators, that his backstory would be developed as a hardscrabble kid from Yancey Street, like Delancey Street, that is, in the Lower East Side, with his Judaism officially acknowledged in a 2002 story, and that's what you're seeing here, written by Carl Kessel and drawn by Stuart Immonen. But Judaism barely existed in Marvel Comics in the 1960s. Except for Izzy Cohen, the Jewish member of the squad of ethnic stereotypes in Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos, whose Jewish identity was rarely mentioned, there are no explicit references in Kirby's and Lee's work at Marvel. Even a sequence in a concentration camp in Sergeant Fury #2 carefully avoids any reference to Judaism. None of the prisoners in the sequence is seen wearing a yellow Star of David or is identified in the dialogue or captions as Jewish, despite the fact that Jack Kirby, or Jacob Kurtzberg, and Stan Lee, or Stanley Martin Lieber, were both first-generation American Jews. Judaism exists as a kind of lacuna in their published work, a fact of their backgrounds that's conspicuous by its absence. Even long after Kirby's signature work at Marvel, in a late autobiographical story from 1983, which is set on the Lower East Side of his youth, Kirby omits any image of Jewish life or any references to his Judaism. Now, although a lot has been said by Jules Feiffer, Michael Chabon, Gerard Jones, Danny Fingeroff, Harry Broad, and many others about the Jewish roots of the American comic book industry, Superman, created by 2 Jewish boys from Cleveland, was the ultimate assimilationist fantasy, Feiffer contended. Much less has been said about the fierce resistance of Jewish creators to acknowledge their identity. Lee, for instance, was always averse to the idea that the Jewish identity of so many of the first generation of American comic book creators had any influence on their work. When he was asked about the Jewish influence on American comic books in a 2002 interview, Lee simply brushed aside the question. You know, I have no idea. I never really thought of it. It's strange when you mention it, that the best-known characters were done by Jewish writers. I guess that is an odd thought, end quote. But Kirby, who remained an observant Jew all his life, had a more complex response that hinted at a more nuanced reality. My generation lied to survive, Kirby told his friend Shel Dorf and other fans in a 1970 conversation when Kirby was explaining why he changed his name from Jacob Kurtzberg. When I tell you my generation lied or died, I'm not kidding, he said, going on to explain how he was perceived as a total alien by the kind of men from the Midwest or Texas that he served with in the Army, even citing one soldier from a small rural town who refused to believe Kirby was Jewish because he didn't have horns. True. In this context, then, of a generation of Jewish creators who lied to survive, the studied omission of Jewish identity in the published work of artists, writers, and editors like Kirby and Lee feels like another of those lies. Just as their Americanized names in print concealed a private Jewish identity, for Kirby at least, Lee as always is more evasive, so too does this silence on the page seem like another mask. Consequently, if Kirby's Jewish identity is reflected in his work, it's coded, I believe, inscribed as subtext to be deciphered later, and expressed openly only in private, as in a Hanukkah card Kirby drew in 1975 and hung on the wall of his studio showing Ben Grimm in a yarmulke and a prayer shawl. When friends would wander into the studio and ask him about the image, he'd just say, "It's a Jewish thing." As a Jewish creature, then, with a rock-like body who uses his strength to protect others, but who threatens also, over and over in the history of the Fantastic Four, to explode in uncontrollable rage, the Thing is a kind of golem figure. But to place him in this tradition also requires us to acknowledge the conflicted and varied history of the golem story. In its most familiar form, of course, the golem is a Jewish fable, a tale of oppression and resistance and the wisdom of learned rabbis, retold over and over by acclaimed Jewish authors like Isaac Bashevis Singer, or in picture books for children sold in temple gift shops. But as many scholars have also shown, the golem story is also partly a Christian invention, taken up in the 19th century by German folklorists like Jacob Grimm and presented as a story of Jewish sorcery and the ineradicable alienness of Jews, reinforcing their utter difference from the Christian societies in which they lived. Even Paul Wegener's version of the story, perhaps the most famous and influential, is a Christian version, though written by a Jewish screenwriter, that presents Rabbi Loew of Prague, the golem's most famous creator, as a sorcerer, and imagines the Jewish ghetto as an Orientalist fantasy represented in fantastic expressionist sets. The golem, as Maya Barzilay argues in Golem, Modern Wars and Their Monsters, has always been an indeterminate figure whose clay can be reshaped in many ways depending on who's telling the story. In this, the golem is also like any long-running superhero whose story is continued and reimagined by many generations of creators from many different backgrounds, working in many different media forms. Again, like the Thing, who's going to be on the screen sometime soon. Again on the screen, that is. Over their long narrative lives, these indeterminate characters can, of course, express many different ideas, from fables of difference and alienness to stories of resistance to persecution, or in many modern versions, as Barzilay argues, to wartime and post-war depictions of the violence and injury associated with technological power, and that's a quote from her book. But both the golem and his latter-day descendant, transformed by cosmic rays, also embody a particular type of Jewish fantasy about the allure and dangers of strength. As Barzilay writes, quote, "The indeterminate golem constitutes an exaggerated enactment of the Jewish ability to transform into the non-Jewish masculine ideal. The hyper-masculine golem alerted readers and viewers to both the enormous potential and danger of such border crossings. Performed on behalf of Jewish populations, but not by Jews themselves, the golem's violence evokes anxieties concerning the refashioning of Jews into more powerful, bellicose combatants," end quote. In his book, Tough Jews, Paul Bryans locates in Jewish culture, particularly in modern Jewish culture, there's the thing. I missed something here. Okay, sorry, missed something. In his book, Tough Jews, Paul Bryans locates in Jewish culture, particularly in modern Jewish culture since the end of the 19th century, a type of a Jewish male yearning to enter the world of bodies from which we perceive ourselves to have been excluded. Commonly represented in European culture as men and women too, with weak, stunted bodies, we heard a little bit about that before, and because of restrictions on Jewish land ownership, farming, and hunting, Jews were denied admission also, these are Brian's words, into the worlds of material production and violence, some Jews dreamed of strength and power. And yet this yearning for strength was tempered, resisted even by another tradition of Jewish gentleness that idealized lives of study and prayer and that counseled a kind of submissiveness which abhorred violence. In the midst of the pogrom that razed the Jewish community of Kishinev in Russia in 1903, for instance, one of the town's rabbis told the Kishinev Jews to be as quiet as water and lower than the grass, end quote. Consequently, in this tension between dreams of power and appeals to gentleness, Jewish bodies and Jewish fantasies of bodies become sites of conflict. In the public sphere, that conflict was waged by the rise of Zionism as a political and cultural movement, manifest in the early Zionist leader Max Nordau's call for a new generation of muscle Jews, deep-chested, sturdy, sharp-eyed men. Those are Nordau's words. But in the imagination, here I think is where the golem is brought to life again in the 19th and 20th centuries, to fulfill that yearning for power and to question it as well. Yes, the golem is a figure of monstrous strength to strike out against oppressors, but his strength, in light of that other tradition of Jewish gentleness, is also dangerous. In some golem stories even, the creature's rampage after it's freed from the rabbi's control takes place on Shabbat, disrupting the observance of the Jewish Sabbath. In these versions of the story, Jewish identity is destroyed by violence too, alongside the citadels and bodies of all those oppressors. And that's a line that's kind of echoing in my mind as I watch events today. All these conflicts, now I'm right, all these conflicts come to life again in the rock-like form of Ben Grimm, the Thing. Well, the Thing has now been eclipsed by more familiar Marvel heroes like Spider-Man and Captain America, who've been popularized on screen. It was Ben Grimm's particular pathos, the endless suffering of man trapped in a monster's body, that first embodied Marvel's signature approach to superheroes in the 1960s, as characters who were defined less by their powers, like DC's heroes, than by their personal weaknesses, their worries, their anger, their unruly passions. In the earliest issues of Fantastic Four, as the characters were only beginning to evolve, the other members of the team, Reed Richards, Mr. Fantastic, the team's leader and father figure, Sue Storm, the Invisible Girl, Reed's sometimes fiancé, and Johnny Storm, the Human Torch, Sue's hot-headed teenage brother, all considered the Thing almost as much of a threat as a partner. Reed, how much more of this can we take? Sue worried in number 2, over on the right side of the screen. Sooner or later, the Thing will run amok, and none of us will be able to stop him. But even after his character evolved into a kind of gruff uncle in the team's family structure, the danger of the Thing going rogue never went away. He could be turned against the others by the alchemist Diablo in number 30, who promised to restore Ben Grimm's human form, or it could be stoked into a murderous rage, twice even in 2 different storylines, years apart, by the mind-control devices of the Wizard, the leader of the Fantastic Four's evil counterparts, the Frightful Four. But when the Thing growls in rage at Reed in the climax of the brutal betrayal of Ben Grimm in number 41, it sounds like the Wizard's id machine has only unlocked the emotions that have always been pent up inside Ben. You did this to me, Richards, he says. You turned me into something so ugly they can only call me a Thing. To be sure, the Thing is also a hero who uses his strength in Fantastic Four against all manner of supervillains and interstellar threats. But in his amalgamation of Jewish identity, monstrosity, power, and a simmering rage that's always got to be controlled, Ben is a kind of a 20th century golem. Moreover, as a golem, he also embodies and struggles with the alienness inscribed in the golem's form by Christian storytellers. If in the versions of the golem story by Jacob Grimm and other Christian writers, the monstrous form of the golem and the magic that brings him to life are symbols of ineradicable Jewish difference, the monstrousness assigned to Jews was internalized by them too. As Sander Gilman details in The Jew's Body, common representations of Jews in European culture as less than human, what Edison was drawing from, as diseased city dwellers afflicted with flat feet, a susceptibility to hysteria, weak muscles, and dusky skin, were also internalized by Jews themselves, who, in Gilman's words, mirror within their own selves the image of their own difference. The Zionist leader Max Nordau, in fact, would issue his call for a new breed of muscle Jews precisely in reaction to these images. That internal struggle Gilman describes would last for generations, though, and was perhaps carried over to America also by Jewish immigrants like the Kurtzbergs and the Liebers, packed away with whatever other rags and keepsakes they could carry, only to appear again in the disguised forms, in the fantastic creatures invented by a generation of Jewish creators in a new junk medium who lied to survive. So here too, I think, in Ben Grimm's loathing of his own body and his sense of himself as a monster, he is again a 20th and 21st century golem, compounded of frightful strength, rage, and profound alienness. Indeed, in that 2002 story, when the Things Judaism was finally confirmed, he admits to an older Jewish friend from Yancey Street that he didn't talk about his Jewish identity because of the monstrousness and difference that the golem symbolized in the Christian versions of his story. It's just, I don't talk it up, is all Ben says. Figure there's enough trouble in the world without people thinking Jews are all monsters like me. Monster, muscle Jew, superhero, and sometimes just a mensch too. Ben Grimm is a golem for our times. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, of course. I'm afraid there's going to be a little bit of overlap. Yeah, hard to follow that now with more golems. Monster studies often reveals that our social progress is less progressive and less teleological than we might hope. And as a species, we remain uncomfortably well prepared to call up ancient horrors to justify modern marginalization, persecution, and even atrocity. Driving home Faulkner's famous line, "The past is never dead, it's not even the past," as anyone visiting the city of Charlotte, North Carolina in 2017 can affirm. However, these studies also reveal that some modern problems have ancient solutions, that we, like our forebears, have a choice to be victimized by the monsters in our heads or to employ them in our ongoing quest for self-discovery and a more harmonious and empathic society. I've chosen to talk today about anti-Semitism because of its strange relationship to the emergence of a particular monster, the golem, which you already know all about. In the very early 20th century, Jewish migration from Eastern to Western Europe, often fleeing systemic oppression, was forcibly stopped, and Jews were confined to ghettos and refugee camps. This would spell disaster for millions in the coming decades. Racial and ethnic tensions flared up, anti-Semitic libels and conspiracy theories that had originated in the Middle Ages experienced a surge in popularity. In plays and early films, Jews became strongly and paradoxically associated with both the spread of Bolshevism and with the dangers of rampant commercialism, with both standoffish iconoclasm and toxic racial mixing, and with being both victims of and creators of urban blight and corruption. Violence against Jews, particularly in Russia and Germany, rose precipitously. In the midst of these troubled times, a very ancient, uncanny monster suddenly enjoyed an unexpected preeminence in Jewish culture. This ancient monster is the golem, drawn from a Jewish legend about a rabbi in Eastern Europe who, in anticipation of anti-Semitic violence against his community, creates a powerful living servant out of clay to aid the Jews. Now, I hope you'll bear with me, but I'm a theater scholar, so what I'm interested in today is a theatrical representation of the golem that premiered in Russia in 1925, which is 4 years after Paul Wegener's movie, which Michael discussed. The Golem, a play by H. Leivik, which is the pseudonym of Leivik Halpern, was directed by respected Moscow Art Theater director Boris Ilyich Vershilov, featuring actors Baruch Chemerinsky as the Maharal, the rabbi who creates the golem, and Aaron Meskin as the golem. Here is that's some old thing. This is Baruch Chemerinsky as Rabbi Lowe in the Habima's golem. A side note, my family name is Chemerinsky, and we hail from the region. But despite what I see as a strong resemblance, Baruch and I are not, alas, related. So, yeah, I know, it's a shame. This play unmistakably uses the golem legend as source material, but profoundly expands the scope of the drama to include some powerful rumination on human ethics and subjectivity. In the first scene, the Maharal of Prague, concerned about rumors of the blood libel on the rise in the city, uses his vast Kabbalistic knowledge to prepare an unliving servant out of river clay. Things start to go wrong immediately. The night is filled with strange presences, including the spirit of the not yet animated golem that appears to the rabbi as a shadowy figure and begs not to be created. "Create me not," he says, You see the stars go out, each one, so will the light go out in every eye that looks on me. And where my foot will tread, a blight will grow upon that place, and what my hand will touch, to dust and ashes it will crumble. Do not exchange my darkness and my stillness for the tumult of the streets and the noise of men. This anxiety about being created is certainly not what the rabbi was expecting. But trusting in his faith, he dispels the figure and finishes creating his monster. Before departing, the figure crosses himself and prays to Christ, which is an unexpected gesture that will become increasingly meaningful as the play goes on. Once created, the golem's relationship with the Jewish community of Prague is equally uneasy. Compelled to obey the Maharal, the golem is tormented by supernatural visions of the coming pogrom, as well as by its status as a thing between two worlds. It is enslaved. No folksy automaton, it rails vehemently against the cruelty and injustice of its existence as a prisoner to the will of the Maharal. The Jewish community is disturbed by the golem's strangeness and mock and abuse it. Forbidden by the Maharal's command from replying or doing violence to its persecutors, the golem bears the degradation as best it can, taking little solace from the Maharal's exhortations that the golem's purpose is much grander. It will be called upon to defend the lives of the very people who treat it so cruelly. Fundamental to the spiritual ethics of Judaism is a concept Ashkenazic Jews call menschlichkeit, which might be described as humanity in the sense of compassion or empathy. The root of the word mensch is not gendered. I always thought it was, but it's not. Menschlichkeit is a conscious decision to act righteously and honorably, and to avoid causing unnecessary harm to any living thing, even and especially when one's enemies act unrighteously and violently. This compassionate aversion to violence is brought into a deeply nuanced engagement in this play. As for the rabbi, forbidden by his own menschlichkeit from taking direct action against this violence, he has created his automaton, a soulless monster, or so he thinks, to do grim tasks on his behalf and shield his own soul, or so he thinks, from evil. But the golem's existence as a proxy for necessary violence comes at an emotional cost to itself. It says, I spurn myself as I would spurn a worm. The golem's capacity for self-reflection and self-loathing gives this play its emotional depth and theological complexity, and renders the golem somewhat more compelling than a mindless automaton or simple-minded brute, and interestingly associates him more strongly with the creature of Mary Shelley's 1819 novel Frankenstein, although it must be said not with the wildly popular dramatic adaptations that dominated European stages between 1820 and 1920. The Maharal, on the other hand, bears some very interesting similarities to stage adaptations of Victor Frankenstein. On a journey into a cave of nightmares, the golem enters a magical circle where he is joined by the Messiah and a third figure, the man with the cross. The presence of a Christ figure in this sacred trinity, in this moment of relative peace in the play, advances Leivik's engagement with menschlichkeit by linking it to a Christian ethos of universal compassion and redemption. Leivik thereby focuses the audience's attention on the impossible paradox the golem embodies. The golem cannot be awake and sentient without also yearning for redemption and a purpose greater than mere violence, and he cannot avoid violence if he is to play his role as a golem. After defeating the ghetto's persecutors, the golem is subject to further torments from the people it has just saved and turns its rage on the Jews of Prague, killing 2 of them. The Maharal experiences the powerful anagnoresis that forms the core of the play's message, that he cannot dodge the requirements of his own ethics by doing violence by proxy. He laments the unfairness of this stricture. He says, on my head falls the blood, on my head. He came to save, and yet he shed our blood. Are we thus punished for our joy, O Lord? Are we chastised because we wish to save ourselves? I cannot help but hear in these lines an echo of those spoken a century earlier by Frankenstein in an 1826 adaptation of Shelley's novel in a play entitled The Man and the Monster, in which Frankenstein says, I am the father of 1,000 murders. O presumption, and this is thy punishment. That's Act 1, Scene 4, if you're playing the home game. But Frankenstein's transgression was one of pride, while the Maharal saw his actions in the context of an existential threat to his people. If the Jews of Prague are forbidden by God from defending themselves, how will they survive at all? Sorry. But In 2002, in the aftermath of 9/11, the question of what is proper behavior in a world filled with violence and irrational hatred inspired a revival of Leivik's play at the Manhattan Theater Ensemble, adapted by artistic director David Fischelson and starring Robert Prosky as Rabbi Levy and Joseph McKenna as his monster. Fischelson had determined to adapt the play in response to the rise in violence and civil strife that rehashed some anti-Semitic canards as partial justification of violent political action against Israel. But in the context of a New York still reeling from the devastating terror attacks on that city of the previous September, Fischelson writes, "A theatergoer's instinct might be to draw an analogy to recent Jewish history. In the wake of the Holocaust, the Jews of the world armed themselves by creating the state of Israel, a golem, to stay further genocide. But now they, like the Jews of Prague, find themselves caught in a cycle of violence that appears to have no end. The golem is not, in this light, a denial of the necessity of resorting to violence. It is a lament of its necessity on this earth." Fischelson's moral ambivalence here reflects that of Leivik, writing in a very different context in a very different time, on the difficulty of finding an ethical middle ground between idealistic pacifism and indulgence in vengeful, if ostensibly self-defensive violence. But for Leivik, it was not merely a question of lamenting necessary violence, but rather his keen awareness of the detrimental effect of unrighteous behavior on the individual who commits those acts. The golem, as a theatrical performance, embodies in real time and space this difficult dialectic and compromised moral position that has become, if anything, even more difficult to sort out in the context of this horribly violent new century. Alicia Solomon, who reviewed Fischelson's production in the New York Times, observed, this is 2002 now, "If the play seems especially vital now, it is not only because some Jews continue to yearn for messianic redemption, it is also because the current generation has a different relationship with the idea of Jewish power than their grandparents, and thus the ability to consider the play's challenging themes anew. A century ago, the fantasy of a brawny and indestructible protector, as Michael was talking about, provided a compelling answer to Jewish vulnerability, even beyond the realm of theater. Taking the logic further, one confronts the most troubling question that some Israelis and American Jews are beginning to raise. Has the militarily mighty Jewish state become a golem for the 21st century, promising protection but leading to peril?" Solomon's critique would probably have both pleased and dismayed the deeply ethical but deeply anxious Leivik, who brought a Christ figure into conversation with his golem to expand his critique of hatred beyond a critique of anti-Semitism and into a more universal lesson in which compassion is held as a sine qua non of civilized human interaction. Violence may be necessary in a violent world, but the violation of one's Menschlichkeit renders one less than human, unfeeling, like a golem, neither fully alive nor dead. Leivik's golem provides little practical advice in a world where racist violence is increasingly normalized, but it remains an eloquent reminder that the struggle for a better world must be as internal as it is political. Thank you.
Questions? Okay.
Hi. First off, thank you all so much for your panel and topics, papers. My question is for the Michaels.
That's our new band.
I specifically during Michael Chemers' presentation and the, I think, parallels that you drew between the Golem and Frankenstein, specifically the part where the Golem asks not to be created. I initially drew another parallel with Frankenstein of the discourse between him and his creator of let me go be with a mate,
Right.
and I will leave you alone,
Right.
and how appeasing the monstrous body is seen as almost a worse fate than the murders that are happening, or in the Golem's case, like complete destruction of a culture. So I guess the thing that I'm thinking more about, and this also connects, I think, to Michael Kobre's presentation, is this kind of co-opting of the monstrous body for a kind of defense that perhaps is in itself, being unable to defend yourself is an anxiety that I think is present. For the golem, it's Jewish cultures. I mean, even in the filmic adaptation that was brought up, I think of other German expressionist films where a body is kind of co-opted in the same way, like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. So I guess that would be where my curiosity stems from, is in the ways that, as speaking to kind of a cultural anxiety of the bodies of that culture not being enough, that something has to be kind of controlled or used as a sort of weapon, a weaponized body, in the same way that the concept of muscle Jews came up in Kobre's presentation. Thank you.
Absolutely. Michael, do you want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, there's so much in there to kind of unpack. First thing I would say is if you go back to the passage in Shelley's Frankenstein, when the monster says, "Create a mate for me," and he says, "We'll go to Latin America and we'll become vegans. We won't eat anything else." But Victor ultimately denies that, and it's out of racial fear. Because, if the monster and the mate can reproduce, there's going to be a new race, and they may overcome us as well. So I think there's that fear of difference, there's that fear of otherness, alienness there as well. In terms of, and again, let me see if I can follow the question. So the question is about the idea of the golem as a proxy for violence. Am I getting that right?
A proxy for violence, but also one whose wants and desires are dismissed in the goal. Thank you. Who's kind of, I guess, conscious is put aside.
Actually, so what that makes me think of in Fantastic Four itself, and this is particularly prevalent in the first 101 issues, 102 issues that Kirby drew. After that, the characterization thins out a little bit, changes a little bit. But always in that, there is the sense that Ben Grimm must sacrifice his own desires while Reed and Sue can go get married and have a normal life, and he can't do that. So at least in this sort of pop culture version of a golem, I think that's very true. The versions of golem stories I studied don't really involve, as I can recall, the golem who is not conscious in the way that this beautiful version from 1925? 1925 represents. The golem here is kind of a mindless creature to be used for destruction or to be used just for ordinary chores as well. So there is no sense of the golem somehow renouncing its own duties and struggling with its fate. I think that comes in other versions. There's also a dramatic poem that was written, I think, 1917, before the Wegener film, before the third of Wegener's films, because that was actually his third golem film that he made, that I do think echoes some of those themes. But again, that's just not one that I studied in great depth.
I think the golem, Michael was referring to the earlier golem manifestations. He's usually a folksy automaton, and they tell him to do something like dig a well, and then they forget to tell him to stop, and he digs a well to the center of the earth, or they say go fishing in the river, and he fishes out all the fish in the river, and they have to push all the fish back in the river, so nobody gets any fish. So they're very funny stories on the whole, until suddenly they're not funny stories anymore because the golem runs amok, and usually because he's asked to do work on the Sabbath. In my experience, he then short circuits and he goes crazy and starts to kill people. I think that's a really interesting point that you bring up, though, about denying the monster's desires, right? And because they're just monsters, right? So why should we pay any attention to their desires? Yeah, I think that's pretty powerful.
Hi, thank you all for such great presentations. My question is for Katya and Shadow. And there's a lot of discussion about the ethnic, the person of color monster within both of your work, but I wonder if you can explicate a little bit more about like this underlying monster of white supremacy that's present in the work as well.
So, for my, is this picking up? Okay. So for my interest, I tend to be really interested in how monstrosity is mapped onto people and how that relates to systems of power. I think what might speak more to your question is something I've talked about but have not yet gotten on paper, but something I've been considering is the ways in which monstrosity is mapped onto individual extremists in what I call the reactionary monster. So to go straight for the standard, Hitler is a monster. Because if you can clip off the end of the ideology of white supremacy, of anti-Semitism, of heterosis sexism, and claim that it's not the ideology that's the problem, it's the individuals who have taken it to the violent extreme that have failed in their humanity, then you can protect the ideology. Because ideologies are self-defending. Because giving one up means coming up with an entire new philosophy of being, and most people don't want to do that. There definitely is this, there are times in which you can see this reactionary usage, and then of course, mostly in the more recent years, I think there's been a big shift since the 60s onward, in which self-conscious occupation of monstrosity, especially by those who are already pushed out of humanity, becomes a way of reclaiming power. Because the monsters have a lot of power. However, if you're going to stand in a monster's shoes, it means giving up things like human rights and protection by law. But if you don't have that anyway, then why not go all in on the monster and seize that power? That shows up in a lot of ways across multiple cultures. The way I've tended to look at it the most, just in my own research, is in the beginning of the off Broadway queer theater ridiculous, Vampire Lesbians of Sodom, the theater that plays with this reclamation of the monster as something to be proud of. And then, of course, this has become even more so with, I think of Lady Gaga and Mother of Monsters, and then her baby monsters of all of the trans and gender nonconforming youth. And the ways in which that it can become something wildly appealing. And I was thinking about that with the question about the golem in terms of this idea of the way in which it appeals, to people, and the ambiguity of the desire to claim the monster's power and the intense fear of the loss of humanity that comes with it, which can be in through guilt for the monster's violence, even if you're putting it onto another body. If you've reduced the humanity of the individual that is doing the violence, as in animated clay, this guilt still goes to the person who is controlling the violence, just as good old guns don't kill people. People make choices that hurt other people. I'm hesitant to name ideologies like white supremacism as monstrous, not because they're not terrible, but because I don't think monstrous and terrible are synonyms. I think that the monsters are a very particular kind of power relationship, non-human but wildly desirable in terms of power and transgression and erotics that I don't think ideologies tend to hold, and perhaps it's just my perspective, but I really don't associate with white supremacy any of the joy of monsters that I think a lot of us here feel, since we're here studying them. You're up, Shadow.
Yeah, I have a footnote in my essay. Sorry, I have a footnote in my essay that talks about an interview that Jordan Peele gave with Craig Melvin on the Today Show on NBC shortly after the film came out. And in their conversation, Melvin sort of pushes to Peele that Nope doesn't feel like a racialized movie. He says that it seems to be not immediately about race, and Peele immediately interjects, I feel, quote, I feel it's impossible to make a movie with people of color and have it not be about race. Hell, I think it's impossible to make any movie without it being about race, because race is all around us. What I think is interesting, and where the notion of Nope and the title came from, is you can't have black people in a flying saucer film and just have it be the same experience. There's a different relationship. And one of the things that I love all three of Peele's films, but I feel that the distance between Get Out and Nope is that Get Out is doing what a lot of great horror films and other pieces of media by black artists and artists of color have done to, again, like Tartaglia talks about in her introduction to the Close-Up special issue, identify experiences in Black Americans' pasts or experiences that can be translated as like horrific or terrifying. But I really love the way that Nope and Her as well instill a more like implicit sense of race in the film. So I think that what I'm trying to ultimately argue in the end is that examples like these, I think, point to an increasing acceptance and respect for Black individuals and Black culture. And when we can just have a movie be about Black individuals in a traditional horror trope, that opens up a lot of tacit respect for Black individuals that maybe wasn't as prominent a few years ago or generations ago.
Thank you all so much. This follows up on the last question and to the same two panelists. Katya, I have so much to think about with you that I know you're going to have answers for me. I want to talk to you after. Awesome. The one thing you had said that stood out, and this question I think is about the identification that you were asking about of villainy being associated with dominant groups, we'll say. That one thing I'm wondering in terms of when you're talking about the DVD history, I love that when certain readings become available when we're with the right audience. And I think that gets to the heart that my questions pose between two short tellings that gets to Jordan Peele. One of them in Elizabeth Young's Black Frankenstein, she talks of the comedian Dick Gregory seeing Frankenstein saying, I was that monster, I identified with it. And he's horrified by this reaction because that connection others him from his audience. In an interesting way, that's how I felt watching Get Out in theaters with a predominantly white audience. I remember, and this anecdote is important to share, so I'll allow it. Before the trailer for Baywatch came on with Zac Efron, and there was this really corny joke that was repeated. What do you mean, you people? You people in this case meant lifeguards. And the whole audience started cracking up at the worst joke ever, except for one Black man in the audience who said, no, no. And after the trailer ended, he continued, no. I love this man. And one thing that it revealed in that audience was a dissensus about how we relate to films. When Get Out came on, everyone was on point. I have never seen white boys hurl themselves out of their seats so quickly to clap for the villainy, when the villainy was punished in that film. Right. And I think in that regard, to the question of Black humanity in horror films that Jordan Peele makes possible, it really felt like what we were trying to recapture in that audience was a sense of white humanity. That's not a critique of Peele. That's an awareness of, I think, that marginalized viewers, when witnessing Monstrosity, we have these techniques of thinking of how do I disavow the connection, say, I'm not that monster on the screen. Right. I felt like perhaps dominant groups hadn't encountered that before, which led to this getting up and overperforming outrage. Right. And so I don't know, I guess the question here just has to do with thinking about when monstrosity is moving more into these explicitly political situations where dominant groups sort of find themselves in the others, what sort of performative tactics and such like that are dominant groups resorting to when placed in this new situation of having to say, I am not the monster that we've been trying to divide ourselves from all along?
Can you say just the last part of the question again? I'm so sorry.
So when dominant groups now are in the position of having to say, I'm not that monster, right? That's a position, this is what makes Dick Gregory so alienated in that audience, saying, I connect with something everyone else can't see. I feel like with Peele, there is an invitation to feel like we're all the good audience. We're all in the same theater, we're all on the same page.
Right.
And I don't know, it feels like that for me is entering us into a new moment of how we perform our spectatorship. Maybe that's what it is. And Katya, that's why I was thinking of what you talk about of watching with a queer audience or watching at home, which feels like it makes possible intimacy that I just didn't feel watching Get Out.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes, I think you're very, very much right that dominant groups have rarely had, especially the core dominances of the American system, of gender and sexuality, and then of race and whiteness and settler colonialism, and of ableism, of the conqueror as all of the white male able superpowered figure. That this population has very little practice being placed in the monster's position, because the vast majority of popular culture is made for the dominant group because they tend to have the most money. And while there have always been resistant traditions, those have mostly been very closed to outsiders, meaning the dominant group. And if they're revealed, then they're double coated. I think of one of my professors talking about the cakewalk and the ways in which the overt mockery had to be recoded and reinterpreted once white audiences became interested in demanding that performance by the people they had power over, whether through actual enslavement or the de facto enslavement of the sharecropping system. That the idea that a white person would be in the audience with the black majority watching the actual performance, not the cleaned up version, and seeing themselves as the fool is obviously absurd on its face, because the society is set up so that that does not happen. However, as the culture has changed in the last 30, 50, 70, 100 years, it has become more possible for subaltern groups to create resistant art and put it out and have it popularized. It's still hard, but Jordan Peele's work is an example of resistant art that has gotten significant attention and mostly publicly positive attention by the dominant group. And I think you're right that a lot of audiences just didn't know how to handle that or what they were supposed to do. And of course, the backlash effect and the self-protection instinct of showing I am not that is incredibly strong, because that self-protective shield is what the dominant group learns from birth. Because otherwise you might look around and notice that the world might not be the same way the ideology says. And so how that will continue to change depends on a lot of factors. I hope that the world gets more democratic, more equitable, more open, and all of those lovely things. However, as we are deep in backlash on a number of axes of power, I'm not counting on the teleological mythology of progress to save us. So, but if the world becomes a better, freer place, then I think the dominant class will have less dominance, and so we'll have to learn to negotiate, not being automatically the good guys. And otherwise, you get the backlash effect and the attempt to crush those who dare question this social order, which is what's happening now. But where it will go is impossible to predict, and I imagine it, even in the short run, it will be a lot of churning as some people make the jump, some people don't, and geographical and political location also drives quite a bit how the dominating local group will handle it.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if this is exactly answering your question, but the thing that I keep thinking about is how I feel like Americans of color oftentimes by like white American theorists or academics. There have been many times in history when folks have read Monstrosity through or as like existing along like racial intersections, almost forcing Americans of color to sort of identify with monsters. And I think it's interesting because in Get Out, I don't think that Peele is necessarily saying white people are monsters. I think that he's saying that white people can do some pretty horrifying things, and the treatment of white American, the way white Americans can treat black Americans can be horrifying. But I just think that points to a certain sense of empathy that Peele might feel as a black American, to like being forced to identify as a monster isn't exactly like a very positive experience. And so I don't think that Get Out is making those same sorts of generalizations or saying like white people are monsters as much as it's saying like, hey, the things that people do can be really bad. So I guess I'm really intrigued by the difference there and the distance between the respect of saying like white people aren't all monsters, they just do monstrous things, versus like what happens if we read monsters through like racial intersections or identities. So I don't know if that's exactly answering the question, and I would love to talk more about it, but I guess it's the thoughts that are bouncing in my head. I hope that that's helpful.
All right, everybody, please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists. We are out of time.